In the humid heart of Georgia, where the cicadas never seem to sleep and the air itself carries the weight of secrets, one story has drifted between the cracks of memory. It begins not with a crowd, nor with a declaration, but with silence, the kind that settles in when the human heart crosses a boundary from survival into something unrecognizable. In 1801, the South was already defined by shadows, plantations where human bodies were measured in coin, roads where fugitives risked everything, and taverns where whispers traveled faster than fire. But within this land, carved by blood and fear, arose the story of a woman who blurred the line between victim and predator, justice and cruelty, salvation and damnation. She was once known as a hunter, and soon after she became something darker, a murderess feared not only by the enslaved, but by those who had once employed her. Her name was spoken in fragments, sometimes hushed over rum in taverns, sometimes shouted across courtrooms desperate for scandal. A woman who had tracked the footsteps of runaways with uncanny precision. She had made her living as part of a brutal economy. Slave catchers, often men hardened by violence, were despised by many and feared by more. Yet the presence of a woman among them made her both an oddity and an object of intrigue. She walked through forests where fugitives carved hidden paths, waded through swamps where lantern light barely pierced the fog, and returned with chains clinking like trophies. It was said she could follow the crack of a twig or the tremor of breath in the brush. She was not just a hunter, she was a reminder that freedom in Georgia came at a cost written in iron and fear. But then, the story took a turn that even the cruelest among her peers did not foresee. For one night, in a rural settlement where the roads narrowed into little more than deer tracks, her name would be remembered not as the woman who captured, but as the woman who killed. The accounts differ. Some insist it was premeditated, a debt turned into blood. Others whisper of a moment when her prey turned into her mirror, and in the reflection, she saw something that shattered her. A runaway, cornered in the dark, begging for mercy. A chain raised like a weapon, and then silence. When the body was found, the hunter had vanished, but the echoes of that night lingered in every whispered retelling. It was no longer a story of pursuit. It had become the birth of a legend stitched with fear. To understand her transformation, one must walk into the broader shadows of her world. Georgia, in 1801, was not merely a place of cotton and tobacco. It was a battlefield of morality where churches preached salvation on Sundays while overseers cracked whips on Mondays. In this clash of righteousness and cruelty, individuals like her existed on the margins, enforcers of a law that itself was drenched in injustice. But when an enforcer turns rogue, the question sharpens. Was it madness, revenge, or an awakening too monstrous to name? The locals did not know. The courts would try, but even their words faltered when set against the reality of what she had done. They called her a murderess. Some called her cursed. Others saw her as a woman possessed by the same darkness she had once hunted. And yet, as her story spread beyond Georgia's borders, it began to mutate. For some, she became a warning proof of what happens when brutality consumes its master. For others, she was a symbol of justice, twisted though it may have been, against a system where cruelty had long been normalized. The truth, buried beneath layers of rumor and fear, is nearly impossible to untangle. What remains is the sensation, even now, of her presence. Walking through the night, eyes sharpened by years of pursuit, her steps both predator and prey. This is not a tale of triumph. It is not a tale of morality neatly tied in ribbons. It is the tale of a woman whose footsteps carried her into infamy, whose choices remain obscured by fog, and whose silence still echoes across the pine forests of Georgia. Tonight we revisit her story, the slave hunter who became a murderess not to absolve, not to condemn, but to understand the darkness that lingers when history refuses to speak aloud. For every scream left unvoiced, every life lost to silence, we step closer to the truth that hides in shadows, waiting, patient, unblinking. And so the question hangs. Was she victim, villain, or something else entirely? The answer may be forever trapped in the silence of 1801. To understand the story of the woman who crossed from slave hunter to murderess, We must first step into the Georgia of 1801, a world defined by contradictions, bound by cruelty, and haunted by silence. The United States was still in its infancy. Scarcely 3 decades past the Revolution, and yet the ideals of liberty and freedom that were carved into the nation's founding words did not extend to all. In Georgia, as in much of the South, freedom was selective, liberty conditional, and lives measured in coin and labor. The plantation economy thrived, its profits swelling on the backs of enslaved men and women whose toil built the wealth of a young nation. Yet beneath the manicured fields and red brick houses, fear and violence lingered like a constant drumbeat, reminding everyone that order was maintained by the lash, the chain, and the unyielding pursuit of those who dared to run. Georgia's landscape in the early 19th century was both beautiful and treacherous. Vast pine forests stretched across the horizon, rivers cut through fertile valleys, and swamps festered with both life and disease. For fugitives seeking freedom, these lands offered hiding places, yet they also presented dangers. Poisonous snakes, wild animals, starvation, and the ever-present threat of human hunters. Slave catchers, often men hardened by poverty or lured by bounty money, patrolled these areas with dogs, lanterns, and weapons. They were despised by the enslaved and distrusted by polite society, yet they remained necessary to maintain the economic machinery of bondage. It is within this grim profession that our subject, an unusual woman for her time, carved out her place. The role of women in early 19th century Georgia was rigidly defined by social norms. They were expected to be homemakers, wives, and mothers confined to the domestic sphere and judged by piety, chastity, and obedience. A woman who chose to step into a man's world, particularly one as brutal as slave catching, would have shocked neighbors and unsettled even hardened men. Her very presence in the field marked her as an outlier, a figure straddling worlds. This anomaly only deepened the aura that would later cling to her story. For if men were already reviled for the profession, what judgment awaited a woman who not only participated, but by all accounts excelled in it? The economic and social climate of Georgia in 1801 made her role even more significant. Cotton was beginning to rise as king, and with it came an increasing demand for enslaved labor. Owners feared the loss of workers not merely as a human absence, but as financial devastation. A runaway meant lost investment, lost productivity, and if successful, the possibility of inspiring others to flee. The stakes were high, and bounty hunters were paid accordingly. A skilled catcher could make a living tracking fugitives, and the woman at the center of our story seemed to have both the will and the instinct to thrive in this grim profession. Yet survival and wealth in this line of work carried an invisible cost, one that perhaps began to erode her from within. Religion, too, played a powerful role in shaping the culture of early Georgia. Churches preached submission and obedience, twisting scripture to justify slavery while promising salvation to the obedient. Slave catchers often saw themselves as enforcers of divine order, though their brutality betrayed any higher calling. Women were particularly bound to these religious expectations, their morality scrutinized under the eyes of neighbors and clergy alike. To be both a woman and a hunter placed her outside the realm of respectability, a figure tolerated for usefulness but condemned in whispers. Her reputation was an uneasy balance of fear, fascination, and disdain. The presence of enslaved communities added another layer to the context. For the enslaved, hunters represented terror incarnate, the sound of dogs in the night, the flicker of a lantern in the trees, the crack of branches underfoot. All of these signals brought dread. Yet they also fostered resilience. Enslaved men and women learned to navigate swamps silently, to erase their tracks, to share secret routes whispered through songs and stories. Some communities sheltered fugitives, hiding them under floorboards or deep in the woods, risking their own lives in acts of quiet rebellion. Hunters like her were both obstacles and embodiments of the system itself, standing between fugitives and the faint hope of freedom. Meanwhile, the wider nation was beginning to wrestle with the contradictions of slavery. In the North, abolitionist voices were stirring, though still faint, while in the South, the institution was tightening its grip. Georgia stood as a frontier of sorts, a place where expansion and agriculture demanded labor, and where those who profited from bondage relied on enforcers like her to maintain order. It was a society where violence was not an aberration but a language, spoken daily and normalized. Within such a landscape, the boundary between hunter and murderer was perilously thin, and the woman's eventual crossing of that line seems less like an accident and more like an inevitability written into the soil itself. The law provided cover for such brutality. Slave codes, written to strip freedom from the enslaved, granted hunters wide authority. They could enter property in pursuit, restrain with chains, even wound if necessary. The distinction between restraint and killing was blurry and accountability rare. Yet when one of their own, particularly a woman, crossed into outright murder, even the courts struggled to categorize it. Was she a criminal? Was she a vigilante? Or was she simply the logical outcome of a society that had normalized cruelty to such a degree that humanity itself became expendable? This is the background into which her story unfolded. A Georgia torn between wilderness and settlement, prosperity and brutality. A culture where women were expected to be silent, yet she roamed, the forest armed and unafraid. An economy dependent on chains, where her livelihood was tethered to human suffering. A law that gave her license, yet a society that recoiled when she went too far. In such a place, her transformation from hunter to murderess was not a sudden rupture but a slow descent, each step shaped by the shadows of her world. To understand her act, we must first understand Georgia itself, a land where silence screamed louder than words, and where every life, whether enslaved or free, was caught in the pull of forces larger than themselves. The descent of the woman from hunter to murderess cannot be captured in a single act, but rather in a chain of events that revealed, step by step, how violence became her language. The stories, pieced together from scattered reports and recollections, speak not only of her actions but of the reactions of those around her, neighbors, fugitives and fellow hunters alike, each of whom witnessed fragments of her unraveling. The first whispers came with a fall. A fugitive, pursued through the marshes, managed to elude her by climbing high into the limbs of a pecan tree. She, determined not to lose her quarry, followed. Branches cracked under her weight, and she tumbled into the muck below, rising with bruised limbs and torn clothing. Witnesses said she did not curse nor cry out, but stood in silence, her eyes burning with a strange fury. The fugitive escaped that night, but the townsfolk whispered that her pride had been wounded deeper than her body, and that humiliation stoked something more dangerous than anger. Another time, in summer heat thick with insects, she and her dogs cornered a man at the edge of a swamp. He resisted, striking her with a branch, but in his desperation stumbled into a nest of hornets. Stung dozens of times, he collapsed writhing in the mud. Where another hunter might have bound him quickly to end the suffering, she watched for long minutes, her face impassive as the man cried for mercy. Only when his body weakened from venom did she chain him, dragging him back like prey. Neighbors who heard of it muttered uneasily, was her patience a form of control? Or was it the enjoyment of pain? There were darker accounts. In the red glow of dusk, a runaway boy was said to have hidden in a woodpile near a mill. She found him, cornered and trembling, and when he lunged with a shard of glass, she responded not with restraint but with her axe. The boy did not live to see another night. It was this act, told in hushed tones in the community, that began to transform her image. She was no longer merely a hunter reclaiming property, she was seen as someone who had crossed a boundary, delivering death when the task was capture. The boy's owner, though mourning the loss of his investment, refused to press charges, preferring silence to scandal. But silence has a way of growing heavy, and soon it was not only the enslaved who feared her. In winter, when frost hung heavy over the pines, there was another incident. A neighbor spoke of hearing screams in the night, ragged, human cries followed by the sharp crack of steel against bone. By morning, the woman was seen leading her horse into town, her clothing spattered, her face expressionless. No runaway was reported caught that night. No body was found. Some whispered that she had killed, not in duty but in impulse, striking, down a soul who had simply been in her path. Others wondered whether it had been a runaway who vanished into unmarked soil. Fear grew not only among the enslaved, but among those who lived beside her. For if she could take life without restraint, who among them could claim to be safe? Stories spread of her knife, a blade she carried strapped to her thigh. It gleamed in lantern light, and more than one fugitive returned in chains with fresh scars across their bodies, cut not to subdue but to remind. Some said she carved marks as if to brand her captures personally, a signature of flesh. These scars spoke louder than testimony, whispered from skin to skin among the enslaved communities, who began to weave her into songs and cautionary tales. She became less a woman and more a specter, a figure parents used to frighten children. Into silence, a shadow who would appear at the edge of the trees. The people of the town could not ignore her anymore. Pastors preached about sin and blood, their words vague but their eyes resting on her pew. Doctors muttered about her sanity, wondering aloud whether a mind could withstand years steeped in pursuit, violence, and fear without bending into madness. Yet nothing was done. Her role was too useful, her presence too profitable. Landowners needed hunters. Hunters needed the law to look away. And so she remained, tolerated even as her legend darkened. One incident, however, shattered even the fragile: tolerance. It was said she pursued two fugitives into the hills, armed with her axe and her dogs. The men resisted fiercely, cornered by desperation, and in the struggle she struck once, twice, until the snow was stained. But when the fight ended, only one man remained bound. The other lay lifeless, his skull split open. The survivor was dragged back, broken and silent, while the dead was left for animals and the wind. Word spread quickly, carried by those who saw the blood trail leading down the slope. This was no act of accident or defense. This was slaughter, plain and undeniable. Reactions divided the community. Some defended her, saying that in the heat of struggle a hunter could not be expected to show restraint. Others recoiled, insisting that she had chosen death too readily, too eagerly. The newspapers did not print her name but spoke of a woman hunter in Georgia whose zeal exceeds duty. That phrase lingered in the minds of many, a euphemism for what they dared not say. She was no longer a hunter but a murderer. Each incident added weight to the story. A fall from a tree, hornets in the swamp, an axe in the dark, screams in the frost, a knife's carving edge, a man's skull split in snow. Together they painted a portrait of descent, not sudden but steady, not accidental, but inevitable. It was as if every pursuit peeled back another layer of restraint, until only the raw core of violence remained. The enslaved feared her as a phantom. Neighbors watched her with wary glances. Fellow hunters, men who once mocked her presence among them, now stepped aside in silence, unwilling to provoke her. Even the dogs seemed uneasy, their howls at night carrying an edge of something unnatural, as though they sensed their mistress had crossed into a realm beyond order. By 1801, her reputation was no longer contained by whispers. She had become a tale retold in taverns, on porches, and in slave quarters alike. The woman who had once been an anomaly in her role was now something else entirely, a figure who blurred the line between enforcer and killer, justice and savagery, law and bloodlust. Her story was no longer about bounty or survival. It was about what happens when a society feeds violence until it consumes the very person wielding it, leaving only a shadow where once stood a woman of flesh and will. The ripples of her actions spread far beyond the swamps and woods where she hunted. In Georgia, at the turn of the 19th century, communities were small, bound together by rumor as much as by blood. And in these circles, the woman's name carried a weight that was equal parts dread and fascination. Among slaveholding families, reactions were conflicted. On one hand, her efficiency served their interests. She returned their property, often more reliably than the men they hired. Her presence was a deterrent enslaved people thought twice before running, knowing the threat of her pursuit. Yet whispers of her excesses stirred unease. The killing of fugitives meant financial loss. A dead slave could not labor, could not be sold, could not produce more generations for bondage. Landowners gathered at taverns, lowering their voices as they debated. Was she too dangerous even for them? Was her violence beginning to undermine the very system she served? Neighbors who lived within sight of her cabin spoke of sleepless nights. They described hearing the barking of her dogs echoing through the pines at hours when no one should be abroad. Some swore they saw figures moving in the fog, her silhouette, axe in hand, or the limp shape of captives dragged behind her. For these neighbors, fear grew not only for the enslaved but for themselves. If she could kill a runaway with so little hesitation, what might she do if provoked by a free man or woman? They avoided her gaze, avoided her path, and taught their children to lower their voices when she passed. Religious leaders tried to frame her within the language of sin and redemption. Pastors, in wooden chapels warmed by lantern light, delivered sermons heavy with references to Cain and the mark of blood. Their words were vague, never naming her directly, but everyone understood. They urged restraint, mercy, and repentance. Yet she continued to sit among them, silent, unmoved, her expression as hard as stone. Congregants watched her closely, wondering whether she listened at all or whether the sermon merely passed through her like wind through a graveyard. Doctors and men of science, limited as their knowledge was, speculated in hushed conversations. Was her mind unhinged? Had years of hunting bent her reason into obsession? Some described it in terms of melancholia or female hysteria, categories of illness that reflected both ignorance and prejudice of the time. A few suggested she was proof that women, when exposed to the brutality of men's work, became corrupted beyond repair. These judgments said as much about their fear of women in power as they did about her actions. Yet none dared confront her directly. The enslaved community, though silenced in public, spoke of her freely among themselves. They created whispered songs, stories passed from fire to fire, describing her as something more than human. She became a bogeyman figure, a ghost woman whose dog smelled sin, whose knife marked flesh, whose axe split bone under the moon. Parents told children to stay close, to keep quiet, lest the hunter's shadow fall upon them. But there was also a strange kind of defiance in these stories. By naming her, by turning her into myth, they made her both terrifying and predictable. A monster, after all, can be imagined, and what is imagined can be resisted. The press, such as it was in 1801 Georgia, was cautious. Local newspapers rarely wrote openly of blood, preferring to veil scandal with euphemism. They called her a woman of unusual zeal, an enforcer of uncommon strength, or a hunter whose devotion borders upon excess. But the tone was uneasy, as though the writers sensed that their readers did not want to look too closely. Beyond Georgia, in distant cities like Charleston or Savannah, fragments of her reputation traveled through letters and hearsay. To some, she was proof of frontier savagery, a symbol of how the wilderness corrupted civilization. To others, she was a warning of what happened when the fragile lines of order blurred into violence. Fellow hunters offered perhaps the clearest reflection. At first, many mocked her, seeing her as an anomaly, a woman trespassing on men's territory. But mockery turned to silence. Men who once jeered her presence now gave way on trails, nodded respectfully, and avoided her eyes. They spoke of her with a mixture of envy and fear. Envy because she succeeded where others failed. Fear because she had crossed a line they themselves hesitated to approach. Some hunters admitted quietly that they no longer wanted to ride with her. Not because of her gender, but because they were afraid of what she might do when corner pressed her. A hunter was supposed to capture. She killed. That distinction mattered. Over time, society's response became paradoxical. She was both useful and dangerous, admired and despised, feared and tolerated. The contradictions reflected the instability of the system itself. A culture built on bondage, violence, and fear could not easily decide whether to punish or reward someone who embodied those qualities too completely. And so they left her in place, a silent figure haunting the edges of their community, never fully embraced, never fully condemned. In whispers, however, the question spread: was she still serving the system, Or had she begun serving something darker, something within herself? The night that marked the climax of her story came without warning, though in truth it had been building for years. Georgia's humid summer air was thick, the kind that clings to the skin and weighs on the chest. The forest near her cabin seemed unnaturally quiet, as though even the cicadas and owls had chosen silence. In the distance, dogs barked a signal that someone was moving under cover of darkness. She rose from her chair with a deliberate calm, lifted her axe, and followed the sound. The fugitive family had been running for 3 nights. A man, a woman, and 2 children, their bare feet raw from the ground, their breathing shallow with exhaustion. They had prayed that the stories of the woman hunter were nothing more than tales. But as they crept along the river's edge, the dogs found them. First the growl, then the howl, and then the unmistakable crack of branches under pursuit. The children whimpered, and the father whispered for silence, pressing their heads to his chest. In the fog, her shadow appeared a figure with broad shoulders, the glint of steel in hand. What followed was less a chase than a ritual. She closed the distance with precision, each step measured. The mother stumbled, her cry carrying across the water. The hunter did not shout commands or issue threats. She moved like inevitability itself. The father turned, desperate, placing himself between his family and the approaching figure. With nothing but a branch in his hand, he swung wildly. The blow landed but did nothing. The axe answered, splitting wood, then flesh. The sound was sharp, final, a noise that echoed in the silence and seemed to stop time itself. The children screamed. The swamp swallowed their voices. The act was not quick. Witnesses later claimed they heard multiple strikes, each one slower than the last, as though she was savoring the moment. Some said she had no intention of capturing that night, no intention of returning anyone to bondage. This was something else, a release, a frenzy born of years of repression, perhaps of madness. The ground was soaked, the air heavy with the metallic scent of blood. When the mother fell, her last gesture was to shield the children, but even that offered no mercy. The hunter's blade moved without hesitation, her expression cold, unreadable in the pale light. What makes the climax unforgettable is not merely the brutality, but the silence afterward. Neighbors, awakened by the dogs, gathered at a distance, torches flickering in the night. They did not intervene. They stood frozen, caught between fear and obligation, watching as the woman cleaned her axe in the river. She did not glance toward them. She did not explain. She simply walked past them, her figure swallowed by shadow, leaving the family broken behind her. None dared follow. None dared speak. The following day, the town was divided. Some argued that she had gone too far, that killing the children was an act beyond any justification. Others whispered that this was the natural end of her trajectory, that no one should have been surprised. But there was no trial, no arrest. The landowners who relied on her services closed ranks, insisting that the fugitives had resisted violently, that her actions were unfortunate but necessary. Yet everyone who had witnessed knew better. They had seen her face, lit by torchlight, and they would never forget. Her legend grew darker after that night. She became less a hunter and more a phantom, less a servant of order and more an agent of death. The enslaved spoke her name only in whispers, adding new verses to their hidden songs. Mothers warned their children not to stray at night, not because of snakes or wolves, but because the woman with the axe still walked. Some said she was no longer entirely human, that the blood of children had transformed her into something else, bound to violence forever. And yet, what made the climax terrifying was not only what she did, but how the community responded. They looked away. They justified. They allowed her to remain, because her violence, however grotesque, still protected their system. It was a moment that revealed not just the depths of one woman's brutality, but the complicity of an entire society willing to let the blood of innocents soak into the soil rather than confront their own dependence on cruelty. From that night on, every sound of dogs in the distance carried a different weight. Every flicker of torchlight in the fog reminded people of her shadow. She had crossed the final boundary, and yet she remained among them untouched, unpunished, unstoppable. The climax of her story was not just one night of blood, but the realization that the line between hunter and murderer had vanished, and no one dared draw it again. In the years that followed, her name slipped into the cracks of memory, surviving more in whispers than in records. Court documents mention her only sparingly, and often under vague titles: a woman of the region, a hunter of renown, a widow of uncertain past. But in the oral traditions of both the enslaved and the free, her figure remained sharp, unforgettable. She was the woman who crossed lines no one else dared, who served as both enforcer and executioner, and who seemed to answer to no law but her own. Some claimed that after the killings, she vanished into the swamps, her cabin abandoned, her belongings left as though she had been called away by something beyond human. Others insisted they saw her years later, older but no less formidable, trading pelts in nearby towns or riding alone at dusk with her axe strapped across her back. Each account blurred the line between fact and folklore, leaving historians to wonder how much of her story was real and how much was legend shaped by fear. The legacy she left behind was not merely one of blood, but of silence. The community that allowed her to continue became complicit, and their silence grew into a larger erasure. Official histories of Georgia in the early 19th century make little mention of her, focusing instead on governors, generals, and landowners. But in the shadows, her presence lingers. Every omission is itself a kind of testimony, a choice to forget what could not be explained or excused. There are darker interpretations still. Some folklorists suggest that her violence marked her not as an outlier, but as a reflection of her society. She was a woman shaped by cruelty, sanctioned by a system that demanded blood to preserve its power. When she turned from hunter to murderess, she may not have broken from that system at all. She may have only revealed its true face. The society that had once cheered her on recoiled in horror, not because she had acted outside its values, but because she had made those values too visible, too undeniable. As decades passed, the stories about her grew more supernatural. Children were told she could appear in fog, her axe gleaming even without moonlight. Some believed she could not die, that the blood of those she struck bound her to the earth. Hunters swore that if they followed the sound of dogs barking in the night, they might glimpse her figure, walking along the riverbanks where she had once tracked her prey. These were not the tales of an ordinary woman. These were the tales of something transformed, something eternal. And yet perhaps the most unsettling mystery is not what she became, but what she represented. She forces us to ask, how many others were there, erased from history, whose violence was permitted so long as it served the system, and forgotten once it grew too terrible to ignore? How many stories of women like her lie buried, their names lost, their deeds preserved only in fragments of fear? In reflecting on her life, we are left with no easy answers. Was she a monster born of her own will, or a product of a monstrous society that molded her into its image? Did she vanish into legend because she defied the order, or because she embodied it too completely? The line blurs, leaving us with only speculation. And in that uncertainty lies the true horror, not in the blood spilled, but in the silence that followed. Even today, the land where she once walked carries a peculiar heaviness. Travelers who pass through at night speak of an unease they cannot explain, a feeling of being watched by eyes that never rest. The riverside paths, overgrown with moss and shadow, still echo faintly with the sound of dogs, though no kennels remain. It is as if the earth itself remembers what people chose to forget. Her story does not conclude with a neat resolution. It lingers, unresolved, like a wound that never fully heals. We are left only with fragments: the blood-stained night, the complicit silence, the legends of her shadow. And in those fragments we see a reflection of history itself, selective, distorted, haunted. The woman who was once hunter and then murderess may never be fully known, but she remains in whispers, in shadows, in the spaces where history falters and memory refuses to die. Perhaps that is the most fitting ending of all. Not a grave with a name, not a record with a date, but a presence. a presence that asks us to remember not only her, but the violence she embodied, the silence that concealed it, and the truths still buried beneath the soil of Georgia. For some figures cannot be buried. They do not fade. They remain, waiting, reminding, haunting.